Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we break down the past and its impact on the world today. In this video, we're tackling a question that's been on the minds of people around the world. Could World War III really happen? Russia and NATO have been locked in a growing standoff, military build-ups, economic sanctions, and political disputes have pushed tensions to levels not seen since the Cold War. But how did we get here? What are the key conflicts driving this rivalry? And most importantly, is there a realistic chance that these tensions could escalate into a full-blown global war? In this video, we're going to break it all down. First, we'll take a look at the historical roots of the Russia-NATO conflict and how it has evolved. Then, we'll explore major flashpoints, military capabilities, and the different ways a conflict could play out, from proxy wars to worst-case scenarios. And finally, we'll analyze expert opinions on whether World War III is truly on the horizon or if diplomacy can keep global war at bay. So stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll have a full understanding of one of the most dangerous geopolitical rivalries of our time. Now, let's get into it. To understand the current tensions between Russia and NATO, we have to go back to the origins of this conflict. This isn't just a recent issue, it's been decades in the making. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed in 1949 in the aftermath of World War II. Its purpose? To counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union and prevent the spread of communism across Europe. At its inception, NATO had just 12 members. But over the years, it has expanded significantly. Today, it consists of 31 nations, many of them former Soviet allies or even former Soviet republics. And that's where the problem starts. From Russia's perspective, NATO's expansion isn't just about diplomacy, it's a direct security threat. Imagine you're Russia, and you see a military alliance that was originally created to counter your influence expanding closer and closer to your borders. That would be like a rival setting up military bases right outside your neighborhood. Of course, you'd be concerned. And that's exactly how Russia views NATO. They see the alliance's growing presence in Eastern Europe as an attempt to box them in, limit their influence, and threaten their national security. This has led to a series of major disputes over the years, from the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia in the 90s to more recent conflicts in Ukraine and Georgia. So, at its core, this is more than just a disagreement over policy, it's a deep-rooted strategic rivalry that has shaped global politics for over 70 years. And as NATO continues to expand, Russia's resistance has only grown stronger. Now that we've laid the historical groundwork, let's take a closer look at the key conflicts that have brought Russia and NATO to the brink of a crisis. Now that we understand the historical background of Russia and NATO's rivalry, let's talk about the major flashpoints that have pushed tensions to their highest levels in decades. These aren't just political disagreements, these are real conflicts with real consequences. First and foremost, the Ukraine War. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, escalating long-standing tensions between Russia and NATO. This wasn't just about Ukraine itself, this was about power, influence, and control over Eastern Europe. From Russia's perspective, Ukraine potentially joining NATO was unacceptable. They saw it as a direct threat to their sphere of influence. But NATO and its allies saw Russia's invasion as an aggressive act that violated international law. The result? Heavy economic sanctions on Russia and billions of dollars in military aid flowing into Ukraine from NATO countries. This war has become a defining moment in modern geopolitics, drawing clear lines between Russia and the West. Then, there's the issue of military build-ups. NATO has significantly increased its troop presence in Eastern Europe, stationing forces in countries like Poland and the Baltic states, right at Russia's doorstep. In response, Russia has doubled down on strengthening its military infrastructure, conducting massive military exercises and deploying additional troops to border regions. This military posturing creates a dangerous situation where one miscalculation could spiral into a full-blown crisis. And modern warfare isn't just about tanks and missiles anymore. We're now in an age of hybrid warfare, where cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic sanctions are just as important as traditional combat. Russia has been accused of launching cyber attacks against Western governments and critical infrastructure, using propaganda to sway public opinion, and leveraging its control over energy supplies as an economic weapon. At the same time, NATO countries have responded with their own measures, trying to counter Russian influence in the digital and economic spheres. But it's not just NATO versus Russia, there's a growing web of strategic alliances that complicates the situation even further. Russia has deepened its ties with China, Iran, and North Korea in an effort to counterbalance NATO's influence. This means that any conflict involving Russia and NATO could have far-reaching consequences, pulling in other global powers and escalating tensions beyond just Europe. So, we've got direct military confrontations, economic warfare, cyber battles, and shifting alliances, all of which make this one of the most dangerous conflicts of our time. But what exactly would a direct military confrontation between Russia and NATO look like? Let's take a look at their military capabilities and see how they compare. Now, if a direct military confrontation were to happen between Russia and NATO, how would it play out? Who has the advantage? Let's break it down by looking at 4 key areas: personnel, military equipment, defense spending, and nuclear capabilities. First, let's talk numbers. NATO has a massive edge when it comes to military personnel. Across all its member nations, NATO has about 3.44 million active military personnel. Russia, on the other hand, has roughly 1.32 million. That's less than half of NATO's total. However, numbers alone don't tell the whole story. Russia relies heavily on mobilization strategies, meaning they can rapidly call up reservists and conscripts to increase their fighting force in a time of war. Next up, military equipment. NATO dominates in air and naval power. The United States alone has more advanced fighter jets and aircraft carriers than the rest of the world combined, and NATO as a whole has superior missile defense systems and cutting-edge surveillance technology. Russia, however, has one of the world's largest tank forces and has focused heavily on developing hypersonic missile technology, high-speed, highly maneuverable missiles that are much harder to intercept. This makes them a serious threat in any potential conflict. Then there's defense spending. This is where the difference becomes staggering. NATO countries collectively spend over $1.2 trillion per year on their militaries. Russia's annual military budget? Around $100 billion. That means NATO outspends Russia by more than 10 to 1. And in modern warfare, money matters. A bigger budget means better equipment, more advanced research, and stronger logistical support. But of course, there's one factor that changes everything: nuclear weapons. Russia holds around 5,889 nuclear warheads, making it the largest nuclear power in the world. NATO members collectively possess about 5,400. The difference isn't huge, but here's what matters: both sides have enough nuclear firepower to destroy the world several times over. And that's why, despite all the military buildup, a direct war between Russia and NATO would be catastrophic for everyone involved. So, while NATO has the advantage in numbers, technology, and spending, Russia still has an incredibly powerful military with strategic advantages in certain areas. The real question is, what would actually trigger a direct conflict? Let's look at the possible flashpoints that could turn this cold standoff into a hot war. So, what could actually push Russia and NATO from this tense standoff into an all-out war? There are several key triggers that could escalate this conflict, and each one carries serious risks. First, NATO expansion. This has been one of Russia's biggest concerns for decades. If Ukraine or Georgia were to officially join NATO, Russia would see it as a direct provocation. Why? Because NATO's policy includes collective defense, meaning that an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. If Ukraine were brought under this umbrella, Russia would suddenly find itself facing NATO forces right on its border. In Russia's eyes, that's an unacceptable security threat, and it could push them to take drastic measures. Then, there's the possibility of direct NATO military involvement. Right now, NATO countries are supplying Ukraine with weapons, intelligence, and economic aid, but they are not directly engaging in combat. However, if NATO were to send troops into Ukraine or directly attack Russian forces, Russia would almost certainly retaliate. This is one of the most dangerous escalation scenarios because it would immediately turn the conflict into a direct war between nuclear-armed powers. Another major risk? Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. We're living in a world where wars aren't just fought with tanks and missiles anymore. A large-scale cyber attack targeting energy grids, financial systems, or military networks could be just as damaging as a physical attack. If Russia were to launch a devastating cyber assault on NATO countries, or if NATO were to target Russia's critical infrastructure, it could spark a real-world military response. And once that line is crossed, escalation could be difficult to control. And then there's the wildcard: accidental military escalations. History is full of examples where wars started not because of intentional aggression, but because of miscalculations, misunderstandings, or even small-scale incidents that spiraled out of control. A Russian jet violating NATO airspace, a naval confrontation in the Black Sea, or a missile strike that lands in NATO territory, any of these scenarios could force one side to respond militarily, triggering a wider conflict. The reality is that while no one wants an all-out war, these triggers are very real, and the wrong move at the wrong time could change everything. But if war were to break out, what would it actually look like? Let's explore the possible scenarios of escalation. If tensions between Russia and NATO were to cross the line into open conflict, how bad could it get? There are several possible paths this conflict could take, ranging from limited engagements to full-scale global war. Let's break them down. The first and most likely scenario is a limited proxy war. This is actually already happening to some extent. Instead of directly fighting each other, Russia and NATO continue to support opposing sides in regional conflicts, most notably in Ukraine. In this case, the war would remain localized, with both sides supplying weapons, intelligence, and economic aid, but avoiding direct military confrontation. This keeps the conflict contained, but prolongs instability and destruction. The next step up the escalation ladder is a regional war. This would happen if NATO intervened militarily beyond just sending weapons and aid. If NATO forces were deployed into Ukraine, or if Russia launched an attack against a NATO member state, it could trigger wider clashes across Eastern Europe. This wouldn't just involve Ukraine anymore, and neighboring NATO countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania could all become battlegrounds. At this stage, military bases, airfields, and infrastructure in NATO territory would become legitimate targets for Russian strikes, and NATO would respond in kind. Then we have the worst-case scenario, a global conflict. This is when the war escalates beyond regional battles and turns into full-scale war between Russia and NATO, possibly involving other nations like China, Iran, or even North Korea. This could mean direct air and naval battles, long-range missile strikes, and even nuclear threats. At this level, the risk of nuclear engagement becomes dangerously high, and the consequences would be catastrophic. But there's one final scenario, a diplomatic resolution. Even in the most heated conflicts, diplomacy can play a key role in preventing the worst outcomes. If world leaders manage to de-escalate tensions through sanctions, negotiations, and peace talks, war could be avoided altogether. However, diplomacy only works if both sides are willing to compromise, and right now, neither Russia nor NATO seems ready to back down. So, the question is, will war break out, or will diplomacy prevail? One of the biggest factors keeping war in check is the fear of nuclear destruction. Let's take a look at how nuclear deterrence plays into this equation. If there's one thing stopping Russia and NATO from going to full-scale war, it's the looming threat of nuclear destruction. This is the ultimate game changer, the reason why, despite all the tensions, a direct military confrontation hasn't happened yet. Let's break it down. First, we have the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This isn't just a dramatic phrase, it's a military doctrine that has defined global security for decades. The idea is simple: both Russia and NATO have enough nuclear weapons to completely obliterate each other. If one side launches a nuclear strike, the other will respond with equal or greater force, leading to total annihilation. In other words, if either side pushes the button, no one wins. And because of this, nuclear-armed nations have been extremely cautious about engaging in direct war. Now, let's talk numbers. Russia possesses around 5,889 nuclear warheads, making it the largest nuclear power in the world. NATO, collectively, holds about 5,400. While these numbers are close, what really matters isn't the quantity, it's the second strike capability. Both sides have submarine-based nuclear weapons, which means even if one country's land-based nukes were destroyed, their submarines could still retaliate. This ensures that even a surprise nuclear attack wouldn't prevent total destruction. But here's the scary part: escalatory rhetoric is increasing. Over the past few years, Russian officials have referenced nuclear options more frequently, warning NATO against further involvement in Ukraine. On the NATO side, some countries have discussed strengthening their own nuclear postures to deter Russia further. The more nuclear threats are casually mentioned, the greater the risk of miscalculation. That's why strategic stability mechanisms are so crucial. Communication hotlines, arms control treaties, and diplomatic backchannels help keep misunderstandings from spiraling into disaster. Treaties like New START, which limits the number of deployed nuclear warheads, are vital to keeping nuclear tensions in check. But with relations between Russia and NATO deteriorating, many of these agreements are either under strain or at risk of collapse. So, while nuclear deterrence has prevented war so far, it's not a perfect safety net. If diplomatic safeguards continue to erode, the world could find itself in a far more dangerous position. But military power isn't the only battlefield here. There's another critical factor shaping this conflict: economics. Let's take a look at how sanctions, energy dependencies, and political pressures are influencing the standoff. While military power plays a massive role in this conflict, economics and politics are just as important. Sanctions, energy dependencies, and internal political pressures are shaping the way both Russia and NATO are approaching this standoff. Let's break it down. First, the impact of sanctions. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, NATO countries, along with other Western allies, imposed some of the most severe economic sanctions in modern history. These included freezing Russian assets, cutting Russian banks off from international financial systems like SWIFT, and banning exports of critical technologies. The goal? To weaken Russia's economy and make the war financially unsustainable. But sanctions have a double-edged effect. While they have hurt Russia, they have also pushed Moscow closer to China and Iran, forming new economic alliances that reduce their dependence on Western markets. Then, we have energy dependencies, which have played a major role in this conflict. Before the war, Europe relied heavily on Russian oil and natural gas. In fact, a significant portion of Europe's energy supply came from Russia through pipelines like Nord Stream. But after the invasion, European countries scrambled to cut ties with Russian energy, imposing bans and seeking alternative sources. This led to skyrocketing energy prices, economic uncertainty, and a race to secure new suppliers. While Europe has managed to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, the shift hasn't been easy, and energy remains a major geopolitical weapon in this standoff. And let's not forget domestic political pressures. Leaders in both Russia and NATO countries are facing serious challenges at home. In Russia, the war in Ukraine has led to internal unrest, with protests, economic struggles, and even military setbacks creating cracks in Putin's control. In NATO countries, public opinion is divided. Some want stronger intervention, while others fear getting too involved. Governments must constantly balance supporting Ukraine while avoiding direct confrontation with Russia, all while managing domestic issues like inflation, public unrest, and political opposition. Finally, we have long-term strategic shifts. This conflict isn't just about the present, it's shaping the future of global politics. Alliances are shifting, economic relationships are being redefined, and military strategies are being rewritten. The longer this conflict drags on, the more likely it is that we will see a complete reshaping of international power structures. So, with all these factors in play, our military strength, nuclear deterrence, economic warfare, and political maneuvering, what does the future actually look like? Let's dive into expert opinions and predictions on whether World War III is truly on the horizon. So, after everything we've covered, the military build-up, the geopolitical tensions, the economic warfare, what do experts actually think? Is World War III inevitable, or are we looking at a long-term cold conflict that never quite erupts? Most experts agree on one key point: a full-scale World War III is unlikely. The reason? Nuclear deterrence and the staggering economic costs of total war. No matter how tense things get, both Russia and NATO understand that a direct military confrontation would be catastrophic. Even in moments of extreme tension, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s or the Cold War military standoffs, world leaders have managed to step back from the brink to avoid mutually assured destruction. And right now, despite all the aggression, that same logic still holds. But that doesn't mean peace is guaranteed. Hybrid warfare is only expected to increase. Instead of tanks rolling across borders, we're seeing cyber attacks, economic sabotage, and disinformation campaigns being used as weapons. The battlefield is shifting from physical confrontations to digital and economic warfare, with both sides using new technology to disrupt each other without triggering a full-scale military response. And then there's the issue of shifting global alliances. The longer this conflict continues, the more likely it is that new global power blocks will emerge. Russia is deepening its ties with China, Iran, and other non-Western powers, forming a counterweight to NATO's influence. This could lead to an increasingly polarized world, where economic and military competition becomes even more intense. That brings us to the most crucial factor, the role of diplomacy. While the situation looks dire, diplomatic negotiations and back-channel discussions are constantly taking place behind the scenes. Even during the height of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union maintained diplomatic ties to prevent accidental escalation. If those efforts continue, they could prevent this conflict from spiraling into a direct war. But if communication breaks down entirely, the risk of miscalculation rises dramatically. So, while a massive global war is unlikely, we are still in one of the most dangerous geopolitical moments in modern history. The actions taken in the coming years, by world leaders, military strategists, and diplomats, will determine whether this conflict stabilizes or escalates into something far worse. Now, let's wrap up everything we've discussed with a final look at the key takeaways from this video. So, what have we learned from all this? Let's break it down one final time. First, Tensions between Russia and NATO are at an all-time high, but a full-scale war remains unlikely. While both sides continue military build-ups, economic warfare, and political disputes, nuclear deterrence keeps direct conflict in check. Neither side wants to risk mutual destruction, which has so far prevented a full-blown World War III. Second, hybrid warfare is the main battlefield. Instead of traditional military engagements, we're seeing cyber attacks, economic sanctions, disinformation campaigns, and proxy conflicts shaping the geopolitical landscape. This is a new kind of warfare, one that's fought in boardrooms, financial markets, and cyberspace just as much as on the battlefield. Third, diplomacy is absolutely essential. No matter how tense the situation gets, negotiations, back-channel talks, and international agreements will play a key role in preventing war. The world has avoided catastrophe before, and if leaders act wisely, they can avoid it again. But if diplomatic ties break down completely, the risk of miscalculation rises dramatically. Finally, the future remains uncertain. This conflict isn't just about Russia and NATO, it's about shifting global alliances, economic power struggles, and the future of warfare itself. The decisions made today will shape international relations for decades to come. So, could World War III really happen? The answer isn't simple. While a global war remains unlikely, the world is entering an era of deepening conflicts that could redefine global politics as we know it. If you found this video informative, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. What do you think is the most likely outcome of this conflict? And if you want to dive deeper into history, check out some of the other videos on truth behind history. We've got plenty more content that breaks down major historical and geopolitical events. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.